Welcome back to Nightmare Chronicles, where the dark tales await. If you're ready for another horror-filled adventure, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Tonight's story will have you questioning what lurks in the dark. It was a cool autumn evening when Sarah and her friends decided to take a walk through the woods near their hometown. They had done this countless times before, gathering around a campfire, laughing, telling stories, and maybe scaring themselves a little with some ghost tales. But this night was different. There was something in the air, a heaviness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Sarah, a college student with a fascination for the paranormal, had always been skeptical about ghost stories. She dismissed them as superstition, thinking there was always a logical explanation for every mysterious event. But this night would change everything. The group of 5 friends, Sarah, Emily, James, Alex, and Tom, set off along the trail. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the dirt path ahead. As they walked, Sarah noticed something strange. The deeper they went into the woods, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie silence that made her skin crawl. "You feel that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "It's like the air is thicker here." Sarah brushed it off. "It's just your imagination, Em. Let's keep going." The group continued, but Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. After a while, they reached an old, decaying cabin that Sarah had never seen before. It stood there, hidden by thick trees and overgrown vines like something out of a nightmare. The windows were shattered and the wooden door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking with every gust of wind. "Let's check it out," James suggested, grinning as he pulled out his flashlight. The others hesitated but followed, their curiosity getting the better of them. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered everything, and old furniture lay broken and scattered across the floor. In the corner of the room, Sarah noticed a strange symbol carved into the wall, its jagged lines forming an unsettling pattern. "I don't like this," Alex muttered. "Let's go back." Before anyone could respond, a sound echoed through the cabin, a faint, whispering voice. Sarah froze. The others heard it too. It was soft at first, like the wind, but then it became clearer, almost like a chant. "Did you hear that?" Tom whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "It's just the wind," Sarah replied, though her voice didn't sound as confident as it had moments ago. She was starting to feel the weight of the unease in the air, as though something was watching them. But then the air shifted again, growing colder, and Sarah felt it, a presence lurking in the shadows. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. Yet her skin tingled with the unmistakable feeling that they weren't alone. The chanting seemed to grow louder. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Everyone jumped back in shock. The flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. "All right, that's it. We need to leave," Emily said, panic rising in her voice. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it shut from the outside. They banged on it, but the door remained stubbornly locked. "Shut up," James said. "It's just a stuck door. Let's break it down." But as he stepped forward to force the door open, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was a man, pale, gaunt, and covered in what looked like dirt and blood. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. His clothes were tattered, and his presence was so chilling that none of them could move. The figure didn't speak, but instead, he pointed toward the back of the cabin, and then Sarah saw it. In the corner, hidden behind an old wooden chest, there was a trap door. It was partially open, and from the dim light she could see something, or someone, moving beneath it. Her breath caught in her throat. "Get out of here!" Sarah shouted, her voice filled with terror. "Now!" The group scrambled toward the door, trying again and again to break it down. But the figure just stood there, unmoving, watching them with those hollow eyes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door gave way, and they bolted out into the night air. They didn't stop running until they were far from the cabin, gasping for breath. When they finally came to a halt, Sarah turned to look at the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear. That wasn't real, Emily said, her voice trembling. That man, he couldn't have been. Sarah shook her head. I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing. It wasn't human. The next morning, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She was still shaken, but curiosity gnawed at her. She researched the area and found something disturbing. The cabin wasn't listed on any maps of the region. In fact, there were no records of it at all. But there was a legend, the story of a man who had once lived in those woods, a man who had disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind a cabin that no one dared approach. The local townspeople spoke in hushed tones about the shadow man who roamed the woods, luring people into the darkness never to be seen again. But that wasn't the worst part. As Sarah dug deeper, she found a disturbing detail. The symbol on the wall of the cabin was connected to a ritual, a dark, forbidden practice said to open a gateway between the living and the dead. It was a warning not to be ignored. For weeks after that night, Sarah felt as though something was following her. At night, when she walked home alone, she would hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, and sometimes when she looked in the mirror, she could swear she saw something in the reflection, just a fleeting shadow, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Then one night, as Sarah sat at her desk studying, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, her voice shaking slightly. A whisper came through the line, soft, chilling, and familiar. "Sarah, I see you." The line went dead. To this day, Sarah doesn't walk through those woods anymore. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows creep along her walls, she still hears that whisper. "I see you." It's as though something from that night in the cabin is still watching her, waiting for the right moment to return. The haunting of Rosewood Asylum. It was late autumn when my friends and I decided to visit Rosewood Asylum, a long-abandoned psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town. The rumors surrounding the asylum had always intrigued me. It had been shut down decades ago, but some locals still whispered about strange occurrences, lights flickering in the windows at night, strange sounds drifting from the broken halls, and sightings of a woman in white roaming the grounds. We had heard all the stories, but we didn't believe in ghosts. At least I didn't. My friends, Mark, Lily, and Jason, shared the same skeptical outlook. We were all students at the local university, and we thought this trip would be just another way to escape the pressure of schoolwork for a night. But what we were about to experience would change everything. The moment we arrived at the asylum, a cold wind blew through the barren trees that surrounded the crumbling building. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the windows, once bright and welcoming, were shattered, with only jagged edges remaining. The air smelled musty and old, like rotting wood and forgotten memories. "Are we sure about this?" Lily asked nervously, glancing up at the looming structure. "Of course," Jason replied, his voice brimming with excitement. "This is going to be fun. It's just an old building." We walked through the rusted gate and into the overgrown courtyard. The place felt dead, like it had been forgotten by time itself. Yet, as we stepped inside, the silence seemed oppressive, heavy with something that wasn't quite right. The front door creaked as we pushed it open, revealing a dim hallway lined with cracked, peeling wallpaper. The smell of mildew hit us instantly. We turned on our flashlights, casting long shadows on the walls as we ventured deeper into the asylum. "Let's split up," Mark suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I didn't like the idea, but none of us wanted to appear scared. We agreed, and I ended up with Lily. We decided to explore the first floor while the others took the second. As we moved through the halls, it became clear that the asylum had been abandoned in a hurry. Old furniture lay overturned, and personal belongings, books, papers, even a few rotting mattresses, were scattered around the floors. There were remnants of what seemed to be patients' rooms, with rusted beds and cracked mirrors hanging crookedly on the walls. We stopped in front of a large door at the end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, and a chill seemed to emanate from within. Hesitantly, we pushed it open. The room was a small office, but it was the desk that caught my attention. It was covered in yellowed papers, as though someone had left in a hurry. One sheet in particular stood out, It was a medical file, its edges torn and faded. I picked it up and squinted at the handwritten notes. Patient: Elizabeth Grayson. Date of admission: April 4th, 1952. Diagnosis: schizophrenia. Symptoms: hallucinations, violent behavior, extreme paranoia, highly dangerous. Treatment: electroconvulsive therapy. Subject frequently mentions a woman in white. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The name Elizabeth Grayson felt eerily familiar. I couldn't explain why, but I was suddenly overcome with a sense of dread. I showed the file to Lily, but she didn't seem as disturbed. "I think we should go," Lily said, her voice tight. "I don't like this," I agreed. The oppressive atmosphere was starting to get to me. But as we turned to leave, we heard something, a faint sound from the end of the hallway. It was a soft scraping, like nails against wood. "Lily, did you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale. "What is that?" We cautiously moved toward the sound. As we reached the end of the hall, we saw a figure. It was a woman, pale, her long black hair hanging loosely around her face, and she was dressed in a flowing white gown. Her back was turned, and she was slowly dragging something across the floor, a sound that made my stomach turn. "Who are you?" Lily called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just kept dragging the object, something that looked like a bloody, torn sheet, across the floor. Slowly, she turned around. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide with madness. She had no pupils, only empty, dark sockets, and her lips were cracked in a grotesque smile. "Leave," she whispered, her voice like a breeze. "You shouldn't be here." Before we could react, the woman suddenly vanished into thin air. One moment she was there, and the next, there was nothing but the empty hallway. Lily screamed and we ran, faster than I thought possible, down the hallway, trying to find Mark and Jason. We didn't stop until we found them on the second floor. Their faces were pale, and they looked as terrified as we felt. "We need to get out of here," Jason said, his voice shaking. "I think we're being watched." But as we made our way back toward the exit, the temperature dropped drastically. The air grew thick with a sense of malevolent energy. It felt like something was pressing against us from all sides, urging us to leave before it was too late. Just as we reached the front door, the lights in the building flickered and went out completely. We were plunged into darkness. Then, we heard the voice again, a whisper soft and cold. "Elizabeth, you're not alone." We didn't wait to find out what that meant. We bolted out of the asylum, not stopping until we reached our car, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The moment we stepped outside, the weight in the air lifted, but the fear didn't. To this day, I've never been able to explain what happened. We went back the next day to look for any sign of the woman, but there was nothing. No trace of her, no sign of anyone who could have been there. The only thing we found was the file on Elizabeth Grayson, her name, her story, and the notes about the woman in white. Later, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. Elizabeth Grayson wasn't just any patient. She had died in the asylum under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was driven mad by the very experiments they conducted on her. Others believe she was a victim of something far darker. But one thing was clear. Her spirit, restless and filled with rage, still lingered in the halls of Rosewood Asylum, waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter. And now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching me, that somehow she knows I know her secret. The last thing she whispered to me still echoes in my mind. "Elizabeth, you're not alone." The Midnight Caller. It was a quiet winter evening when I moved into my new apartment in the heart of the city. I had just started a new job, and this was my first time living alone, away from my parents. The building was old, but the rent was cheap, and it seemed perfect for me. The apartment was on the third floor, a one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a creaky floor. Nothing fancy, but it would do. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my things, decorated the place a bit, and settled into a routine, but as the nights went by, I began to feel like something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it. Just a general unease that seemed to linger in the corners of my apartment. It was as if the walls were watching me, I chalked it up to being in a new environment, adjusting to living alone. But then, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It started with the phone calls. The first one came about a week after I moved in. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when the phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, an unknown number. Hesitant, I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound casual. There was only silence on the other end. I waited for a moment, expecting someone to speak, but the silence stretched on. Then, I heard a faint, raspy breath. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I asked again, my voice trembling slightly. The breath came again, louder this time. Then, the line went dead. I was unnerved, but figured it was probably just a wrong number or a prank call. I didn't think much of it, and I went to bed that night trying to push it from my mind. The next night, it happened again. The phone rang around midnight, and I was already in bed trying to sleep. I stared at the ringing phone for a moment, then reluctantly picked it up. "Hello," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. This time, I heard something different. A low whisper, almost inaudible but unmistakable. The voice was distorted, like it was coming through a bad connection, and it repeated the same phrase over and over. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. My hand was frozen, holding the phone to my ear. Then, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something, breathing heavily. The phone line went dead again. I jumped out of bed, my hands shaking. I checked the caller ID, but it was the same as before, an unknown number. I turned off my phone and threw it on the nightstand, hoping the calls would stop. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The air in the room felt colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside the window made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. The next day, I went to work as usual, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, I decided to leave my phone off entirely. I wouldn't let it bother me, but when I returned home, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The apartment door was ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it when I left, and yet now it was standing open, just a crack. I couldn't bring myself to go inside. My heart was pounding in my chest. Slowly, I pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone standing in the shadows. But there was nothing. The apartment looked exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The phone was on the floor, just inside the door, and the cord was twisted in strange knots, as if someone had yanked it violently from the wall. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, and that's when I saw it. The caller ID was already lit up, showing an unknown number. I could barely breathe as I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end came immediately, as if it had been waiting. "I told you, you're not alone." I screamed and slammed the phone back into the cradle. I backed away from the phone, my eyes wide with fear. Then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the wall near the door was something I hadn't noticed before. Scratches. Long, deep gouges like something or someone had scraped them into the wood. I ran out of the apartment and didn't look back. I stayed with a friend that night, too terrified to go home. I called the landlord the next morning, but when I went back to the apartment to pack my things, the scratches were gone. There was no sign of the strange phone calls or the twisted phone cord. The apartment looked normal again, but the feeling didn't leave. It stayed with me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. And to this day, I still don't know who or what was behind those calls. All I know is that it wasn't a prank. The voice, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It was all too real. I moved out of that apartment a few days later and I never looked back. But the fear hasn't gone away. Sometimes when I'm alone, I'll hear the faintest whisper in the back of my mind, and I'll feel that same cold breath against my ear. You're not alone. The eyes in the mirror. I'd always been a practical person, someone who believed in logic and reason. Growing up, I had never been one to entertain stories about ghosts or things that went bump in the night. But that all changed when I moved into my first apartment after graduating from college. It was a small, affordable unit in an older building, and at first, it seemed perfect. The apartment had its quirks, of course. The elevator often malfunctioned, the walls were thin, and there was an old full-length mirror in the hallway that gave me an odd feeling every time I passed it. It wasn't an antique or anything particularly special, just a regular mirror framed in dull, dark wood. But there was something unsettling about it, something that made me feel like I was being watched when I walked by. I tried to ignore the feeling, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But things started happening that I couldn't explain. It started with the noises. At night, when I was lying in bed, I would hear faint scratching sounds coming from the hallway. It sounded like fingernails scraping against the walls, like someone was walking slowly and dragging their nails behind them. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, the sound of old pipes or something. But it happened every night, always around the same time, just after midnight. Then, one evening, I came home late after a long shift at work. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside, exhausted. But something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, and the apartment seemed unnaturally still. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just the late hour getting to me. But as I walked down the hallway, something caught my eye. The mirror. It was reflecting something that shouldn't have been there. I stopped in my tracks. In the reflection, I saw my own figure, just as I should have. But behind me, just over my shoulder, there was a shadow. A dark shape standing perfectly still just beyond my reach. It was difficult to make out, but it seemed like the silhouette of a person. A tall figure, dressed in dark clothes, with a head that seemed unnaturally large. I whipped around, heart pounding, expecting to find someone standing in the hallway. But the hallway was empty, just as it should have been. The silence was deafening. I stared at the mirror for a moment longer, my mind racing, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I looked back at the reflection, the shadow was still there, closer now, as if it had moved while my back was turned. I quickly turned away and walked into my bedroom, locking the door behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something unseen, lurking just out of sight. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just overtired, but the unease lingered, gnawing at me. The next few days were uneventful. The noises continued, but I had learned to ignore them. However, something strange started happening with the mirror. Every time I passed it, I noticed subtle changes in the reflection. My figure would shift slightly as though I was moving without meaning to, even when I stood perfectly still. The shadow in the corner of the mirror grew more defined, more distinct, and at times I could almost see its features. Eyes, mouth, an expression that seemed angry, twisted. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection, willing the shadow to reveal itself. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and I felt the air grow colder. I focused on the reflection, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it happened. I watched in horror as the shadow in the mirror moved independently of me, its form becoming clearer, more solid. It raised one arm slowly, as though reaching for me. I felt a cold, oppressive presence behind me, as though someone was standing just inches away. My breath caught in my throat. I dared not look away from the mirror, but I could feel the air shift. The shadow's hand inched closer, its fingers almost brushing my shoulder. Suddenly, the room went dark. The light bulb above flickered, then went out completely. I spun around in a panic, my breath coming in sharp gasps, but the room was empty. Silent. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting in my bed, staring at the mirror, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The next day I decided to take the mirror down. I didn't care if it was a bad idea to remove something so large and heavy on my own. I needed it gone. As I unscrewed the frame from the wall, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air around me seemed charged, as if something was about to happen. But when I finally pulled the mirror off the wall, the reflection was gone. There was no shadow, no figure, just the bare blank wall behind it. I felt a momentary relief, but that night the calls began. My phone rang around 2 a.m. I groggily answered it, expecting it to be a wrong number or some telemarketer. But there was only silence on the other end, and then in a voice that was barely a whisper, I heard it. "I'm still here." The line went dead. The calls continued for the next few nights, each time the same message. "I'm still here." I could hear the whisper in my ear just as clear as if the voice were right behind me. I had had enough. The mirror had come down. The shadow was gone, at least from my apartment. But something malevolent, was still haunting me. I moved out of that apartment the very next week, and when I returned to retrieve the last of my things, the building had been condemned. They said there were structural issues, but I always wondered if it had something to do with what happened there. I never heard that voice again, but sometimes in the quiet of the night, I still feel it. Something lurking just behind me, watching, waiting. And every so often when I pass a mirror, I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that shouldn't be there. And I wonder, what if the mirror was never the problem? What if it was just the doorway? The silent neighbors. When I first moved into my apartment, I was relieved to find a place in the city that was affordable and quiet. It wasn't the nicest building, but it was convenient for work, and the rent was low enough for me to comfortably live on my own. My neighbors were mostly quiet too, something I appreciated given how chaotic my life had been recently. However, after a few weeks, I started noticing some strange things. At first, it was little things. Faint knocks on my door when I wasn't expecting anyone, muffled voices late at night that seemed to come from the apartment next door. But these weren't the usual sounds of people talking or laughing. The voices sounded off. There was no tone, no emotion behind them, just quiet murmurs, as though people were communicating but didn't actually want to be heard. I brushed it off. It could have been the thin walls, or maybe the neighbors had odd habits, I thought. But the knocking didn't stop. Every night around 11 p.m. there was a soft, persistent knock on my door. It was never loud enough to be heard by others, but I could always hear it. 3 knocks, then a pause, followed by 3 more. It wasn't like someone was trying to get my attention. It was just a rhythmic tapping, as though whoever was doing it was waiting for something. One night, I decided to confront it. I opened the door, ready to find whoever was responsible for the disturbances, but the hallway was completely empty. No one was there. I stood there for a while, just staring at the quiet, dimly lit hallway. It was eerie how still it was. I was about to close the door when I heard a faint whisper from the apartment next door. "Help us." I froze. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it wasn't one that sounded human either. It was rasping, distorted, like the words were being spoken through some kind of filter. For a moment I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. The door next to mine was closed, but something didn't feel right. I knocked lightly, trying to make myself sound casual. No response. The following night, the knocking came again. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 3 more. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone, called the landlord, and asked if anyone had been living in the apartment next door. He confirmed that the unit had been vacant for months. There were no tenants currently living there. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to visit the apartment the next day. The building's management let me in, and I walked into the unit next door, a sense of dread creeping over me. The apartment was completely untouched, almost like it had been frozen in time. The furniture was still there, covered in dust, and there were old newspapers scattered on the floor. But it wasn't just the mess that unsettled me. It was the air. It was thick, cold, and there was a heavy feeling in the room, as though something had been trapped inside for a long time. I stepped into the living room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I noticed something strange on the wall. Symbols. They were scrawled across the plaster, drawn hastily in what looked like chalk or old ink. Some were familiar, like runes or symbols I had seen in books on the occult, but others were foreign to me, jagged and unfinished. as though they had been drawn by an unsteady hand. Then, I heard the whisper again. "Help us." I whipped around, expecting someone to be standing behind me, but there was no one there. The apartment was as empty as it had been moments ago. My heart raced, and I stumbled backward toward the door. But before I left, something caught my eye. There was a small, framed photograph on the floor in the corner, half covered by the dust. I picked it up, wiping away the dirt. The photo was of a family, 2 parents and 2 children. They were standing outside this very building, smiling, seemingly happy. But as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the background, standing in the doorway of the building, there was a shadowy figure, a tall, dark shape with hollow eyes. I didn't know what to think, but I knew I had to leave. I returned to my apartment that night, trying to shake off the feeling that I had stumbled upon something I shouldn't have. But the knocking didn't stop. In fact, it only grew worse. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more, and then the whisper. "Help us." I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and left, staying with a friend for a few days. When I returned, the knocking was gone, but the strange feeling in the building remained. It wasn't until months later that I learned the truth. The apartment next door had been the site of a tragic event years earlier. The family in the photograph had lived there, a husband, wife, and 2 children. They had been found dead in their apartment, the cause of death officially listed as a carbon monoxide leak, though no one could explain the strange marks on their bodies or the unsettling symbols found in their home. Their deaths had never been fully explained, and the building had been under investigation for years before it was cleared and sold off. I never went back to that apartment. I moved out of the building shortly after, and I never looked back. But sometimes, when I pass by the old building on my way to work, I swear I can still hear the faint knocking and that same raspy voice whispering in my ear. "Help us." The disappearing roommate. It was the beginning of my 2nd year in college, and I had just moved into a new apartment off campus with a roommate, Emily. We had met through a mutual friend, and though we didn't know each other well, she seemed nice enough. The apartment was old, with creaky floors and narrow hallways, but it was affordable and located in a quiet neighborhood. Perfect for studying, or so I thought. The first few weeks passed without incident. We spent our days attending classes and our evenings lounging around, chatting or watching movies in the living room. Emily was friendly but reserved. She had a habit of disappearing for hours at a time, but I thought nothing of it. Maybe she had friends in the city or preferred to spend time alone. But after a month, things started to get strange. I noticed that Emily's behavior became even more erratic. She started locking her bedroom door whenever she was inside, even if she was just napping. I asked her about it one evening, half jokingly, but she gave me a strange look and simply said, "It's just a habit." At first I thought it was no big deal, but then things started to escalate. I'd come home from class and find the apartment completely empty, even though Emily's car was parked outside. I'd check her room, and the door would be locked, but she'd be nowhere to be found. It wasn't until late in the evening that she'd return, usually in the middle of the night, her face pale and her eyes wide. She wouldn't say much, just collapse into her bed without a word. One night I stayed up late studying for an exam, and I noticed Emily's door was slightly ajar. I tried to ignore it, but something about the situation felt off. The silence in the apartment was unnerving, so I decided to check on her. I walked down the hall to her room and gently knocked on the door. "Emily?" I called softly. No answer. I opened the door a crack, but before I could peek inside, I heard her voice from behind me, soft and raspy. "What are you doing?" I spun around, startled, and there she was, standing in the hallway, her hair disheveled and her face expressionless. I must have looked surprised because she quickly added, "I was just resting." "I didn't hear you." I nodded, feeling uneasy. It wasn't like Emily to startle so easily, but I brushed it off and went back to my studies. However, the strange behavior didn't stop. The next morning, I woke up to find that Emily had disappeared again. This time, I looked around the apartment, hoping to find some sign of where she had gone, but there was nothing. Her room was locked again. I tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. That afternoon, after trying and failing to reach her, I decided to go to her classes to ask if anyone had seen her. When I arrived at the campus, I learned that she hadn't been in class for days. The professors hadn't heard from her, and no one seemed to know where she was. I was starting to panic. Something was wrong, and I could feel it in my bones. That evening, I came home to find the apartment eerily quiet. Emily's door was still locked, but when I checked the kitchen, I saw a half-eaten sandwich on the counter, as if she had been there just moments ago. I went to her room, knocking once again, but this time there was no response. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a bobby pin from my drawer and attempted to pick the lock. The door clicked open with an unsettling creak, and I stepped inside. What I found left me speechless. Her room was perfectly neat, as though nothing had been disturbed. But there, in the center of the room, was something strange, a large antique mirror that I was certain hadn't been there the day before. It stood tall and out of place, reflecting the empty space in the room and casting long, shadowy reflections. As I walked closer, I felt a sudden coldness in the air and my breath caught in my throat. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart pounded and I turned around quickly, expecting to see Emily. But the room was still empty. I rushed out of the room, leaving the door ajar, and checked the rest of the apartment. There was no sign of Emily, no indication of where she had gone or what had happened to her. I called her phone again, and this time, it rang. But the strange thing was, the call didn't go to voicemail. It was as though someone was listening on the other end. I could hear faint breathing, ragged and shallow, as if someone was standing right next to me, but no one answered. I hung up and called the police, but when they arrived and I explained everything, they didn't seem convinced. They searched the apartment and questioned me, but they found no sign of foul play. Her belongings were still there. Clothes, books, even her laptop. It was like she had just vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, staring at the mirror in Emily's room, feeling its cold presence. Around midnight, I heard a sound from her room, a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. I walked to her door, frozen with fear. When I opened it, the mirror reflected nothing but darkness, as if the room itself had been swallowed by shadows. I stepped inside, but as I walked closer to the mirror, I felt a strange pull, like something was calling to me from the other side. Just as my hand touched the cold surface, the phone rang again, the same shallow breathing, the same eerie silence. But this time, I heard a voice, soft and distant, just above the breathing. "She's never coming back." I stumbled backward, horrified. The mirror began to crack, lines forming in its surface like spider webs. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it shattered, sending shards scattering across the floor. I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The next morning, I found the apartment empty. Emily's car was gone, her things still untouched. The police never found her, and neither did I. The apartment building's management claimed they had no record of her, and no one knew where she had gone. They even claimed that I was the first tenant in the unit in years. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear footsteps echoing in the hallway, and a faint, breathless whisper coming from the shattered mirror. A voice that says, "She's never coming back." The shadows in the basement. It was my first week living in an old house that I had rented on a whim. It was an old 2-story Victorian house, tucked away on a quiet street, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The rent was surprisingly cheap, and the house had a certain charm. High ceilings, antique furniture, and a large backyard with an overgrown garden. It looked like it had been frozen in time, and I thought it would be the perfect place to start over. The house had one particular feature that I found fascinating: the basement. The door to it was tucked away behind a creaky wooden staircase in the kitchen, and it always felt a little colder whenever I passed by it. I had heard from the landlord that it was a storage space, but when I went to inspect it, I found that it went deeper than expected, with a large, dimly lit room that had a concrete floor and exposed pipes along the walls. There was an old furnace that hadn't been used in years and a few dusty boxes scattered around the edges of the room. I didn't think much of it, other than it felt off. The basement was one of those places that just didn't seem inviting. But being new to the house, I tried to ignore the nagging feeling in my chest and focused on settling in. For the first few days, everything was fine. I unpacked my things, went to work, and did my best to get used to the quirks of the house. But then one evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, I heard something strange coming from the basement, a faint scraping sound, like nails against stone. It was so quiet that I almost thought I had imagined it, but it came again. Scrape, scrape, scrape. My stomach dropped. I froze, standing still in the kitchen, trying to make sense of what I had heard. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, old pipes, or perhaps even an animal. But something about it didn't sit right. I decided to ignore it and went about my evening, chalking it up to the odd noises that older houses tend to make. The next night, the sound came again. This time I could hear it more clearly, scraping followed by a soft shuffling noise as though something or someone was moving in the basement. My heart started to race and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, staring at the door below. It was an old wooden door with a rusty doorknob, and I had never been able to bring myself to open it fully. But this time, I couldn't ignore the sounds any longer. Something or someone was down there. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way cautiously to the door. I could feel the cold air seeping out from the crack at the bottom, and the smell of old dust and mildew was thick. With shaking hands, I turned the doorknob and pushed it open, the door creaking loudly. The basement was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight. I swept the beam across the room, my heart pounding in my chest. Everything seemed normal at first. Dusty boxes, old furniture, and the furnace still sitting quietly in the corner. But then, I noticed something strange. The far corner of the room was unnaturally dark, almost as if the shadows were gathering there. At first, I thought it was just the angle of the light, but as I focused more on it, I saw it move. A dark figure seemed to emerge from the shadows, crawling along the floor like a twisted silhouette. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A human form, crawling with an unnatural, jerking motion, as though it was struggling to move. I froze, unable to move or scream. The figure seemed to pause, then slowly turned its head towards me. I saw nothing but darkness where its face should have been, just blackness, deep and endless. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me with terrifying speed, and I slammed the door shut in a panic. I ran up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and locked myself in the kitchen, trembling with fear. I couldn't understand what had just happened. There was no way something could be down there. I hadn't heard anyone enter the house, and the only other person who had access was the landlord, who lived miles away. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, clutching my phone, listening for any sign of movement. The sounds from the basement had stopped, but the unease never left. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, made my skin crawl. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. The next morning, I decided to leave the house for a few hours just to clear my head. I needed to get away from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the place. When I returned, I was shocked to find that the basement door had been left wide open. The light was on, and the room below was completely visible. I hesitated, unsure of what I would find. But some force I couldn't explain, pulled me toward it. I descended the stairs cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, the room was exactly as I had left it, but there was something different. The boxes, the furnace, everything was in the same place, but the far corner of the room was now empty. The shadow, the figure was gone. I walked around the room, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking, watching me from the dark corners. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else, scratches on the wall, deep gouged marks like something had been clawing at the walls for days. I ran back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me, and tried to ignore the growing sense that I was being followed. For days after, the sounds in the basement continued, scraping, dragging, and the occasional faint whisper. But I never ventured down there again. I stayed in the upper floors, avoiding the basement at all costs. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was always there, watching, waiting. I moved out of that house 2 weeks later. The landlord seemed confused when I told him I was leaving early, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay there any longer. I told him about the noises, the figure, the scratching on the walls, but he just nodded and smiled, as though he'd heard it all before. I don't know what I saw in that basement, but I can still hear the scraping sometimes late at night. And when I close my eyes, I see the figure, crawling out of the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The Haunting of Room 502. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I was the type of person who liked logic and science, dismissing any odd occurrences as coincidence or imagination. But my experience in Room 502 changed everything. I was staying at an old, well-known hotel in the city. It was a historic building, one of those places that looked elegant on the outside but had an air of decay on the inside. The hotel had been around for nearly a century, and while it had been renovated multiple times, you could still feel the history in the walls. The wood panels in the hallways creaked with every step. The elevator doors groaned as they opened and closed, and there was always a chill in the air no matter how hot it was outside. I checked in at the front desk and was given my room key. Room 502. The clerk handed it over with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and there was something about his demeanor that struck me as odd, but I thought nothing of it and headed up to my room. The moment I entered Room 502, I felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The air was heavier, colder, and the silence was almost deafening. I shrugged it off as an old building quirk. Perhaps the AC was broken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The room itself was quaint. 2 twin beds with faded floral sheets, a small desk, and a large mirror that hung above an antique vanity. The room was clean, but the floorboards creaked with every step, and there was an unsettling draft that blew through the cracked window. I tried to make myself comfortable, but as the night wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just tired and imagining things, but it didn't help. Around midnight, I was lying in bed when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound coming from the hallway outside my door. It was slow at first, like someone was walking with a limp, dragging their feet across the floor. The sound grew louder as it got closer, and my heart started to race. I got up and peeked through the peephole in the door, expecting to see someone, perhaps a guest, stumbling back to their room after a night out. But there was no one there. I stood there for a few moments, confused and unsettled. The hallway was empty, completely silent. I locked the door and went back to bed, convincing myself I was just hearing things. But sleep didn't come easy. The dragging sound continued sporadically throughout the night, and every time I was about to drift off, it would return, closer and louder, as though something was circling outside my door. The next morning, I went downstairs to grab breakfast. The hotel lobby was almost empty, with only a few elderly guests quietly sipping their coffee. I approached the front desk to check out, but before I could leave, I asked the clerk about the strange noises from the night before. "Excuse me," I started. "I don't mean to sound strange, but last night I heard some odd dragging sounds outside my room. Was there some sort of maintenance happening?" The clerk's face immediately darkened. "Dragging sounds? You were in Room 502, weren't you?" I nodded, taken aback by his sudden change in demeanor. "Be careful, young man," he warned in a low voice. "Room 502. It's not a good room. It's not one we put people in unless we have to." I stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He hesitated for a moment before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "The story goes, a woman died in that room years ago. They say she fell from the window, but I've heard other things that are harder to explain. People have heard the dragging sounds too. There's been reports of strange occurrences for years, but nothing's ever been proven." I didn't believe him. I thought he was just trying to make the hotel sound more interesting, playing on the typical ghost story rumors that often surrounded old places like this. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes that made me uneasy, something between fear and resignation. He quickly changed the subject, telling me that my stay had been paid for and offering me a warm smile before I left. Despite my skepticism, the experience lingered with me, The dragging sounds, the eerie atmosphere of room 502, and the odd way the clerk had reacted. That night, I decided to return to the room to get my things, thinking that perhaps it was just a coincidence or a figment of my imagination. I entered room 502 once more, this time with the intent to leave. I packed my bags quickly, trying to ignore the chill in the air. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed something that made my stomach turn, a faint dark stain on the floor near the bed. I bent down to get a closer look and realized it wasn't just a stain. It was a series of deep, irregular scratches, as if something had dragged itself across the floor. I stepped back, my heart racing. The dragging sound I had heard earlier suddenly made sense. It wasn't coming from outside my door, it was coming from inside the room. Just as I was about to leave, I heard it again, louder this time. The dragging sound, followed by a soft shuffling noise, but this time it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from behind me, right in the room. I turned, expecting to see something, anything, but the room was empty. Nothing was there, and the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I checked out immediately, my mind racing with confusion and terror. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in that room, but I'm sure of one thing. Something was in there with me. Something that didn't belong. When I left the hotel, I couldn't help but look up at the window of room 502. The curtain was drawn, but as I stared at the darkened window, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing there, just beyond the glass, watching me. I never returned to that hotel, and I never will. Whatever haunted room 502 was real, and it was something I will never forget.